two would like to come up, Zoe and Tanya, and we will see if we can get a way to ask you a couple of questions. Zoe's got a microphone. Tanya, you can go here, and I'll start with my question can you just introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about Life Therapies and what you do there?
Sure. I'm Zoe.
And I'm Tanya.
We're from Life Therapies Victoria. I've been counselling for close to 30 years, but Life Therapies Victoria began under a gum tree about the week of the pandemic. And the reason it started the week of the pandemic was my business partner, Matt Glover, and I were getting inundated with requests from people needing more support than what either of us could give individually. So social distancing had begun, and we were sitting outside under a gum tree, and so we decided that we would form a partnership. And that has just grown and grown exponentially.
And I you might need to
You jumped on board.
I jumped on board about that gum tree time. As you know, Zoe and Matt were inundated, and so they needed a little bit of extra help. And yeah, I was lucky enough to join them. My background was actually from yoga therapy for many, many years, and I moved into counselling from them. So I've been working with Matt and Zoe for the last few years. And what I love about Life Therapies Victoria is that it's not just talking therapy. We move into so many different modalities because one size doesn't fit all when it comes to working with people's mental health. So for those people that, don't talking therapy is not for them, we have all sorts of things like yoga therapy or forest therapy or
Sand play,
horticulture. So it's wonderful.
I'm intrigued by all of those things. Tell us what motivates you to do what you do and how long you've been doing it, because I think that's significant.
Yeah, probably close to 30 years. I got into counselling originally through foster care. One day, without going into all of this story, one of our foster care kids had greater needs than I was able to give them. So I went to the minister at my church of the time, and he said, go speak to the local counsellor. And she said, come and do a little course I'm training in. And there I became a counsellor. So what motivates me, I think, is seeing opportunity for people to change. So trauma is really the focus of much of the work that we do. And seeing people, like we'll talk about today, so many people don't get the education and understanding of what actually happens in their body and their brains. So I think for us, helping people to understand normal responses and giving them tools to change, that's exciting. Yeah.
And as I said, I came to counselling through yoga, and I've been teaching yoga for nearly 10 years. But what I noticed is most people that come, it actually wasn't so much about their physical health. It was coming to learn tools to help them manage their emotions and quiet down their minds. And through that, I got to know a lot of their backstory, and I realised that it wasn't enough as a yoga teacher to hold that space. I had to go and do the counselling as well, and those two things combined worked really, really well. So then I started to become quite fascinated with the power of counselling, and I really, I love it.
Good. Last question. What did you do yesterday, Zoe? And voting is not the correct answer, is it?
It is not. Yesterday I moved our practice, or Tanya and I moved our practice from Croydon Hills, where we've been for 13 years, in this tiny but very cute little moving van. So I must say I panicked a little bit when this tiny little truck arrived, and we have a huge amount of plants and furniture. But these lovely gentlemen arrived, and he says, no worries, love, we do more than one trip. So we did multiple trips from Croydon Hills to the beautiful Warrandyte. And we are now overlooking the valley, and we've got all of our furniture in, some of our furniture unpacked, and we will spend this week setting up the rest of the centre now in Warrandyte.
Well, we are incredibly grateful that on a weekend like that you have found time for us and possibly for people on live stream. Are we back on or no?
We're recording it and then we'll put it up later on.
Great. Okay, so for those who... Yep. If you have anyone who would be interested in this session, please let me know. We will make sure you get the recording of it. So I will leave it to you
Thank you.
guys. Keep questions in your mind. There will be an opportunity for questions a little bit later.
Thanks, Sally. Thank you so much for having us here today. We get really excited about opportunities. As I may have mentioned, education is really important for us in the counselling field. So as well as counselling, I have lectured for many, many years, teaching in the counselling field. So that's part of what I like to do. So I want to start off today. We're really looking at what happens in our brain and what happens in our body when we have trauma and when we have too much stress over a period of time. Certainly since the pandemic, over the last couple of years, we have been inundated in our counselling practice, and I'm sure you have also been a part of conversations and impacted perhaps yourself by stress and trauma through this time of change. One of the reasons Matt and I were sitting under the gum tree outside our building having the conversation was we just couldn't keep up with the needs, and that was really at the end of the fires. So we were both involved in the fires work, and then we were being contacted in those very early days by schools and communities around us, and we realised we needed to be doing more. And so we put together Life Therapies Victoria, and at that stage we put together a very simple website, which the contacts will be there, simply to put together resources for people. And that website is still there, just with some of the educational resources. I want to start today with a story about a bear, and I use this bear story just to explain what happens in our brain and what happens in our body when our fight and flight response gets triggered. So this is my bear at the window story. If you can imagine, Sally and I are just sitting and having a nice cuppa. We're relaxed, everything's really calm, and we're just enjoying a really good chat about moving into Warrandyte. And suddenly a bear comes up to the window, and it's a really grisly bear, and he doesn't look very friendly. And in fact, he looks like he's going to jump in the window and eat, well, preferably Sally, not me. I'd like to stay alive. But what actually happens is a little fella in here called our amygdala goes off, and it shoots a whole lot of adrenaline into our body so that we're both ready to fight the bear, run away from the bear, or play dead and hope Sally, not me, gets eaten by the bear. That's how our brain is designed to work. This day, however, our bear decides the gum tree looks better to eat, and he ambles away. Fortunately for Sally, she doesn't get eaten. Our body then says, I can regulate, my heart rate can slow down, everything's going to be okay, and everything goes back to normal. That is how our body is designed to work. That's called regulation, and we'll talk a bit about regulation as we go on. So our brilliant brains are designed to look after us in an emergency, to help us to fight, to help us to run, to help us to play dead if we need to, and also to regulate. But what happens if the bear doesn't go away? What happens if the bear keeps tapping at the window or breaks in and makes life scary for a really long time? What happens when the bear is COVID and it settles in for a really long period of time? Our cortisol levels, our stress hormone level goes up, and we know this from research. We know that people's cortisol levels, the stress hormone, has gone up and is staying up. So for many people, we have this increased stress level now over a sustained period of time. So our brains are having to adapt to live with this increased stress over a longer period of time. Cortisol is becoming a major factor for many people, and it's not really very good for our health. So one of the problems that happens with increased cortisol, if you imagine living with a bear at the window all of the time, it would be really hard to get to sleep at night time, because you'd be thinking, what if the bear comes in now? What if there's another emergency? One of the things that happens when we're in that state is we actually get less of the chemical called serotonin. Serotonin is that feel good, feel relaxed, feel nice. And if we have less serotonin over a period of time, we may get more depressed, we may get more anxious. And what we're seeing in the pandemic is a significant increase in anxiety, in depression, in people returning to old coping mechanisms, eating disorders, drinking, the extra bar of chocolate, or 5. We know people are returning to old coping mechanisms because they want to feel good, they want to get what we call a dopamine hit. So this all relates to our brain chemistry. So we're trying to do things to help ourselves to feel good. Our cortisol levels are remaining high, and so we're finding other ways of trying to cope. Is that making some sense? Yeah. At this point in time, we know people's concentration levels are not as good, learning is more difficult, motivation is more difficult, lots of things are more difficult. Tanya's going to speak to us a little bit later about our parasympathetic nervous system. The bear at the window has moved in. Our systems are having to adjust to living differently with COVID here. So here's a picture of our brain. We're going to talk about 3 primary areas just briefly. Don't worry if you don't remember the words, you'll get the gist of what I'm talking about. If you want to have a look at this, there are downloads on the website. We're not trying to sell you anything on the website, they're just there as free resources. So we're going to look very quickly at the cortex, this top part of the brain that looks like sausages. We're going to look at this darker brown area, the limbic region, which has the amygdala in the middle. And then we're going to have a look at the brain stem where all our automatic functions take place. Oops. This cortex up the top here is the largest and most complex part of our brain. We are all using our cortexes at the moment. It's responsible for our higher functioning. It's the part of our brain that says, I've got to pick up the sausages on the way home for tea, and I've got to do this other task at the same time. It helps us to do all of that complex thinking. If the bear comes, it gets less blood flow and oxygen. So in trauma, it shuts down and we become what we call subcortical. We start operating below our cortex. If I'm living in a constant state of trauma or hyperarousal, it makes concentration and life very difficult because I'm kind of operating in the lower parts of my brain. It's responsible for my reason, my logic. Can you remember a time, I'm not asking you to answer it, but I want you to think about it, a time when you've been panicking and trying to make a decision? It just doesn't work really well. It's because you don't have as much oxygen and blood supply to allow that thinking to work properly. And what we try to do typically is think harder, and what we want to help you to do is recognise my brain's offline, I actually need to relax, I actually need to slow down. Then when I get the oxygen back up there, then I'll do my thinking. It seems counterintuitive, but it actually works. This part of the brain is fully developed by the time we're about 25. And so all through our teen years, all through our growing up, we're actually functioning a lot of the time still down here. So it takes a long time for this part of the brain to develop. So young people whose prefrontal cortex is not fully developed, sometimes are still operating down here. So you can imagine that during the pandemic, for our students going through school and high school, their brains are not yet fully developed, and then they've got these additional chemicals and stresses going on. So life for them has been additionally difficult and stressful, and so we need to be aware of that and supporting for them. This limbic region in the middle is the bit that we get really interested in. This is the little part that has that smoke detector that goes off. It's the car alarm of the body. It is mature at birth, so babies' little amygdalas are working. And we've all seen that dysregulated baby, red and screaming. And what do? We co-regulate. We help regulate the baby because the baby can't regulate itself. We pop it up on our shoulder and we pat it and we calm it. And what we're doing is naturally regulating that baby. We need the same thing sometimes. When we are dysregulated, we need to calm and soothe ourselves. And that's really what we're talking about today. It's the part of the brain that stores those memories, those automatic memories like riding a bike, brushing your teeth, all those automatic memories are stored in this part of the brain. The hippocampus we won't focus much on today, but it's mature between the ages of 2 and 3. It gives us context to memory. The reason we mention it here is what happens when you're traumatised, what happens to your memories. They kind of all go out the window, they don't work as well. So we know that during this period of time, people's memories are not working very well. People will come in and they'll say things like, but I'm doing really silly things like putting the tea towel in the fridge and the cheese in the pantry. So it's really important that people at least know, yeah, that's really normal at the moment, because all of these parts of your brain are under stress. It's really normal that you're doing things a little bit differently. The brainstem, right down the back here, is responsible for your normal everyday brain automatic functions: breath, respiration, temperature control, heart rate. So if I'm really traumatised, if the bear has really given me a very bad fright, I might be seeming to rock in the corner. I might be curled up in the fetal position. That's called hypoarousal. I've just gone into shock. And what my brainstem is doing is keeping me going, it's keeping me alive, but it might seem like I'm not very there. I've gone into shock. And again, we want regulation at that point in time. We want some calm breathing, we want soothing and support. And in a slide or two, we'll look at a different image of that. This corpus callosum is the bridge between the left and the right side of the brain. Again, you don't need to remember the words, but it's important to understand that this part of the brain is the neural highway. It's actually a bundle of nerves. And again, when we have trauma, this part of the brain, the neural highway, is interrupted. We don't process, we can't concentrate as well. It just doesn't work as well. And so when people are saying, I can't study for my exams, or I'm forgetting things in that really important meeting, it's because this little fella is just not working as well as it normally does. So it's taking time to calm our bodies down allows it to work a little bit better. So instead of beating ourselves up and saying there is something wrong with me, I'm not functioning properly, learning that there are reasons why our brain and body is not working properly and it's related to that brain chemistry, we can at least be a little bit kinder to ourselves and to those around us. This is the window that I've been referring to, and it's a different way of looking at the brain. I won't spend a huge amount of time here. You can have a look at this on the website if you're interested in. There's a lot of words, so I don't want to overwhelm you, but if you look at this yellow section in the middle, if you see this as the cortex, if we are cool, calm and regulated, if we are doing okay, we are in this yellow section. If we have a nice wide window, we can cope with everyday stresses. We have what's known as psychological flexibility, and we can cope with some stressors taking place. But if I have too much stress or too much trauma, or I've had a lot of childhood trauma or a lot of trauma over a long time, my window might be narrower. I have some clients who say to me when I put this, I'll draw this up on the board, and they'll go, so I just have a flat line. I don't have a window in the middle. I'm either up the top or I'm down the bottom. I'm so dysregulated all the time, there's just no window for me at all. And so that's helpful for me to understand because it gives me a clue of how we need to begin to work. We need to work really well on regulation strategies because they're either feeling up the top in hyperaroused, they're anxious, they're overwhelmed, life is really feeling very chaotic for them, or they're shut down at the bottom in this freeze response and they're feeling very disconnected from life. And so until we get some window, until we get some normal, life isn't functioning very well. And certainly since the pandemic, we've seen a significant increase of people saying life feels like they're out of the window more often than not. So the idea is to try and broaden the window, and that's all about strategies. My brain will work better. I will think more clearly if I can work inside my window. Is that making some sense? Okay. So, what do we do about it? You'll hear us talking about regulation as counsellors. Different things will work for different people. And it's no good me just saying, well, go and do this particular strategy if that particular strategy for you isn't going to be something that gels with you. We've got to work with different people to find out what works for them. Tanya's going to take us through some breath work in just a moment, but it's about working out what for you is calming and regulating. So we'll talk about a few different things. There might be some family things that you like doing together as a family. It might be games or board games, it might be sports or creative things. It's about you knowing for yourself what that thing is. And I often say to people, create a list of things that you have as a go-to and then go and do those things. People say, well, I did that breathing exercise, or I went and did my creative drawing, but it didn't last all day. It may not, and that's okay. You go back and you do it again. I talk often with people about having a mindful cup of tea. Now, a mindful cup of tea isn't anything magic. It's just being really intentional, having a nice cup, making perhaps a fragrant cup of herbal tea, sitting in the sun or in a favourite chair and unwinding. Well, is that going to last me all day? Probably not if my day is really stressful. But if it's given me a break, then it's worthwhile for that period of time. And then later in the day, I might need to go for a walk around the block, or I might need to go and do another thing. It's the intention of continuing practices throughout the day as I need to, rather than continuing activities that activate my stress and not doing anything with intention to wind it back down. So it's throughout the day doing practices as you're able to. So regulation practices are really anything that becomes grounding, allowing your heart rate to slow and reducing the adrenaline and the cortisol. Working with our breath is a simple practice, which Tanya's going to bring us in just a moment. So we know that we're in this for the long haul. A couple of years in, we know that COVID isn't going anywhere very quickly. We've got to learn how to live with this. And what one of us needs may be different from the next, and that is okay. Checking in with ourselves and checking in with those around us is important. Below is just a little of what we've learned working in the practice, both through the fires, where we're working up and down the East Coast, and since the pandemic. We know the basics of sleep, rest and nutrition is really important. And people, I think, when we get stressed, they're the things that often get pushed out the window. So whilst it sounds very basic, they are actually very important. Our spiritual and our mindful practices that help us to slow and regulate become really important. We know limiting our exposure to media, and not just the news, but social media, online, limit how much you feed your brain with things that can become distressing is really important to do. Regular exercise, and the reason we talk about regular exercise is it actually balances out the chemicals in our brain. Having routine, and this information is all research evidenced. It's not just what we've found in the practice, it's what we see in the practice, but it is also evidence-based. Talking with others as you're able to, and or journaling. Being aware of your window We've done this talk in any number of schools, and I had a principal say to me recently after I'd done the window of tolerance, he said, Zoe, it's so good, I come into the staff room now and people are talking about where they're at in the window of tolerance. And what that means is if I've got a dysregulated teacher, they can actually be saying that, and we can be ensuring that we're putting the supports into place. So the language becomes helpful. That's the kind of stuff that we like to hear. Using humour when you can is really important. There's a lot of serious stuff happening in our world at the moment, and we know there's a lot of serious stuff, but we still need to use some humour when we're able to. Having interests is really important, using our creativity, taking time in nature, even in your walk. We offer forest therapy. I'm not trying to advertise that, but what we do in forest therapy is we don't just go into nature and do a really fast walk. The whole idea is we go into nature, we attune, we slow down. It's stuff you can do every day. Go outside, play like you did when you were kids. Go outside, touch nature, be in nature, and slow it down. Okay, Tanya, would you like to come and join us? Thank you.
Everyone hear me okay? No. That's all right. What about now? Yeah, I'm a quiet talker. So that's a good segue for what I'm going to talk about. Zoe certainly talked about how, recently many of us have been put in a heightened state. Perhaps we know this, but how do we bring ourselves out of it? I mean, Zoe's given lots of beautiful examples of things that we can do. But one of my favourite things is using the breath, because one, it's so effective and it's available, and we don't have to take ourselves out of situations to use it. We can do it anywhere. So, when the bear is at the window, we go into our sympathetic nervous system, which is our fight or flight. What we want to be doing is bringing ourselves back into that parasympathetic nervous system. And that's the part of our nervous system that allows us to be a little calmer, the heart rate slows down. So how do we do it? One of the conduits to it is the vagus nerve. Some of you would have heard about the vagus nerve. For some people, it's a new concept. But basically, the vagus nerve is one of the longest nerves in our body, and it connects our brain to our organs, and they talk to each other. And so the vagus nerve is connected to the parasympathetic nervous system, which can help us come into our calm state. And one of the ways we can work with vagal tone is through the breath. So slowing down your breath actually activates the vagus nerve to come into action and brings us from the sympathetic nervous system, or it helps bring us from the sympathetic nervous system into that calmer parasympathetic nervous system. When we work with the breath, it's interesting because it doesn't always work for everyone when they're in a heightened panic state. Sometimes coming into a breathing practice actually makes it feel worse. So it is a good thing to practice every day so that when we do come into a challenging, like a panic attack or something like that, we're very used to breathing in this way, and so it's a tool that activates a lot quicker. Sometimes people in panic actually trying to control their breath actually can make them even more anxious. This doesn't happen all the time. So I always try and advocate that we work a couple of times a day with our breath, or even if it's for 5 minutes. I wear usually three things on my bracelets on my hand, and try to do my breathing practice 3 times a day, and every time I do it, I move it to the other wrist. So if at the end of the day I've got all 3 on one wrist, I haven't done anything, so I have to quickly do 3 rounds. But it's just a good reminder. I try to do it in the morning, maybe around lunch, and then before dinner. It's like a little intervention for my mind and my body, just to bring myself back into a calm state. And when you're doing it every day, you're actually toning your vagus nerve, and over time, it takes it very quickly. If you start to breathe in a certain way, very quickly your body associates that with, okay, she's okay, everyone calm down. So the more you do it, the more effective it is, I believe. There's lots of ways of working with the breath. You can count the breath, you can work with the pauses of the breath, you can just observe the breath. One of the most effective ways to tone the vagal tone is to work with deep belly breaths, which I'm sure many of you will have heard of. And it's interesting because as a culture, certainly us ladies and a lot of men are told to hold our bellies in and, keep ourselves held tight. And that's not very conducive to taking a good full breath. We actually want to breathe in a way that our belly can open. So as we inhale, our belly can actually open. And for some people, that's quite a foreign concept of letting your belly open. We're so used to holding it in. But it's what we want, because if you think about the diaphragm is like a dome-shaped sheath between the upper torso and the lower. And as we breathe in, this diaphragm has to move down. It massages the abdominal organs. It moves down so the lungs can actually expand fully. A lot of us actually have tight diaphragms that become quite rigid, and we breathe high up here. And when we're breathing high up here, the diaphragm's not moving down, so there's not enough space for expansion. When we're breathing up high, it actually is signaling to our brain that we're not very calm, we're on alert. So when we get the chance to breathe down, really fully take that breath, we're sending a message that actually we're okay, we're breathing fully and deeply. She wouldn't be doing that if she was in panic, she'd be up here. So training that belly breath is really, really important. But it has to be done without strain. Seems like there's so many rules to just breathing. So many rules. There's no point, and I talk about this in my classes, if I'm asking you to breathe in a certain way and you're actually straining to do that, you're just sending a message to your brain that you can't breathe properly. So when we're doing our breathing practice, we've got to do it with a sense of the inhale is expansion and the exhale is easeful, because otherwise, if we're straining, we're just telling ourselves that we can't breathe. So that's why it takes a little time to practice these deeper breaths. Also, you might have a cold, so you might be trying to do a breathing practice and you can't get the breath in, which sends a heightened state into your nervous system. So that's important to think about whenever you're working with the breath, is you want to do it with a sense of ease. That's my number one rule. So I thought maybe we could do one now. If you're up for it, you don't have to. I'll talk you through. One of the other tools that we'll use today is something that we call Nyasam, and it's the sense of touch as well. So you'll bring your thumb to the base of the first finger. You just rest your hands on your thighs, and you bring your thumb to the base of the first finger. And as you breathe in, you simply slide your thumb to the tip. Pause there, and as you breathe out, you're simply sliding your thumb back to the base. So it's that easy. And then the next breath, you can move to the next finger, sliding the thumb to the tip on the inhale. The exhale, sliding the thumb to the base. What that is doing is another sense to bring you into the present moment. Because I'll be asking you to watch the breath and feel the expansion. Sometimes that's not even enough. Your mind will still go to whatever you're doing this afternoon, because the mind is like that. It's always jumping around. So grounding yourself with a sense of touch is just another layer to keep it into a mindful practice. So if we just now sit up nice and tall, relax your hands on your thighs. And remember, the number one rule is easefulness. And just close your eyes. If you're not comfortable to close your eyes, just have a soft gaze towards the floor. And just notice your unique breath. Don't try and change anything, just notice the inhale and the exhale. Just the expression of the breath, just as as it is. Maybe how low it goes into your lungs. Is there any restriction? Just noticing the exhale, how the exhale feels. And now begin to deepen your inhalation, and I'll guide you through. So you're going to inhale and fill up under the collarbone, fill up the high ribs and let the lower ribs flare out, belly opens. And then as you exhale, you're just drawing the belly in and up a little, diaphragm moves up and out, the air comes out through the nose. So you're inhaling, filling up the top part of the lungs, the middle, the lowest part of the lungs, ribs flare out, belly opens. Exhale from the bottom up, so exhale from the belly, up and out through the nose. Think about how a baby breathes. When they breathe in, their whole body expands on the inhale. And when they breathe out, their whole body contracts. So as you breathe in, feel your torso three-dimensionally opening. And as you exhale, let the breath come out through the nose slowly. Relax your shoulders and relax your face. Once you've established that connection to breath, we'll start working with the sense of touch. So on your next inhalation, slide your thumb to the tip of the first finger. Then pause at the end of that breath. When your body's ready to exhale, slide the thumb to the base of that first finger. When you're ready for your next breath, take the thumb to the next finger and do the same. Inhale, sliding to the tip. Notice the end of the inhale. Pause there when your body is ready to exhale, not before. And slide your thumb back to the base. And just keep going with this with a sense of ease. Let the inhale feel expansive and the exhale easeful. And then let go of that practice. Keep your eyes closed if you can and just follow your breath. Just notice how you feel. And then when you're ready, slowly blinking the eyes open. So that's a really easy practice to do, and we want to be able to really have that sense of expansion as we inhale and that belly opening, so that means the diaphragm is moving down. I always think that we need to do about 12 breaths to make a difference. And the way that I count that is actually with my hand. So one breath here is at the first crease, so I'll do one inhale, exhale, and then second breath, third breath, fourth, fifth, sixth, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and that's my 12 breaths when I've reached. So instead of you having to count 12 breaths, it's a really simple way to do that. So it's a lot going on. But I hope that that very, very small little practice perhaps you didn't, but perhaps you did just feel a little bit of shift in your energy afterwards. And so the idea is that 12 breaths can take about 5 minutes. So if you're feeling at work or at home, or you need to find some regulation, if you feel yourself becoming heightened, you know that you actually can self-regulate just doing 12 simple breaths, 5 minutes, and then you can see how you feel if you need anything more than that. But certainly the biggest rule is to not do it with a sense of strain. If you're trying to get that big breath and trying to get that breath out, you're just sending a message to your brain that you're not doing well. So just expansion. Think like a baby. As they breathe, their whole body opens. And as they exhale, they just have that beautiful, and we lose that as adults. We start to, instead of breathing with our whole body, we start to breathe from here. So we just want to move it all down. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much. I have always known the importance of breathing, but not why. So this idea that what you're talking about and the sort of more instructive nature of it, increasing blood flow, that makes perfect sense. Have you had that moment where you've gone, oh, I can think now? It's really important, and that was just so good for walking us through some practical understanding and some practical tips. Now, there will be all sorts of other resources on the website. Raf may have something available to put up. If not, we'll talk to Zoe afterwards. But now is your opportunity, even one of the slides that has the website on it. Right, everything will be on the Southern website, so you'll be able to find that. Now is your opportunity to ask any curly question that you'd like.
Tanya will answer the curly ones.
Any simple question that you'd like, anything you would like. I would just like to add that you talked about exercise. I love the idea of forest therapy. I so want to know more about that. I asked Alyssa's permission for this via text a few minutes ago, but when she was in year 9, in that really difficult phase when everything starts to close in, we would go for a walk each night. It took probably 8 minutes to get around the block, and we would pick, this is really naughty now I actually say it out loud, that someone had a tree in their front yard that had gum nuts, and every day we'd go and collect a gum nut. Are they still in your room, the gum nuts? Yeah. As a reminder that everything will be okay. So you might have similar practices you'd like to share, you might have questions you'd like to ask, please go for it. Now, if there are questions that are personal, they won't make it to the video, and that's the bonus of not having live stream working. So go for it.
I just want to say thank you for that. I've been going to counselling, they've taught me about that breathing technique, but I didn't understand all the bodily functions that are causing you to go into that stress. So for me, it's been informative to understand that kind of thing. So I just thought I'd say thank you for that. It's quite hard to take the time out every day to breathe like that, but I think when you do it, it does kind of make a difference the way you handle stressful situations. And I completely agree with what you've been saying about the pandemic and the stress that it causes people. I know I end up going to counselling because I just lose my temper all the time. So it's taught me to deal with that, but I think it's important that people recognise the stress we're under as well, and when you need help, go and find it, because just our simple techniques make a big difference in people's lives, I think.
Thank you so much for your feedback. Yeah.
You're all panicking.
Yeah.
Do you have a kind of tip how to help someone in that moment start self-regulation?
I think there's two different things.
Can you just repeat the question?
Oh, sorry, yes. How to help a teenager in a panic attack. Such a good question, thank you for asking. I think there's two different things. It's how to be with that person in the moment of the panic attack, and then perhaps at a later point or a prior point of can we get some strategies together for if there's ongoing panic attacks. So in the time of the panic attack, it's let's just be a calm presence. So we call that like with the baby, we call that co-regulation. So what Tanya's been taking us through is self-regulation. When we have the strategy for ourselves and we can regulate ourselves, that's self-regulation. We will all need some co-regulation sometimes when we are just being a calm presence for the other. And it will really depend on the person we are with. Sometimes walking with somebody because we're actually moving can be helpful. Sometimes if somebody's really distressed, they can't even do that. And so sitting with them and whether they can breathe or not, it really depends on whether they're hyper or hypo at the time, whether they can move around or not. And so sometimes just being with them is enough. Sometimes getting them moving and going for a walk outside or around the space they're in is enough. So it really depends on what the behaviour is at the time. I think the more important is if this is whatever the age of the person is prone to anxiety attacks, can we have a range of strategies so that as the panic attack is approaching or as we're getting to that point, we either put some breathing practice into place or we know that we go for a walk or we know that you go and have a shower or we know that we do a range of things at that particular point in time. And again, different things will work for different people. For my daughter, who's well an adult now and has her own children, but through those adolescent years, we put a basketball hoop in the back garden and they would just go outside because they needed to use the energy up. And so that's what we did. And so there isn't an exact formula, but it's trying to work out ahead of time. And again, as Tanya said, we want to practice those things not in the moment of the anxiety attack, but if they're in place, we know that in that moment, the neural pathways, the pattern's already set in place.
So I'm not quite sure what my question is, but I'm just observing, we talk about the pandemic and going through trauma and stress, and then just being aware, you watch the news and people in a war zone. From the body's point of view, is the sort of the stress and trauma, living day-to-day life, ongoing life in a war zone, are we sort of in the shallow end of the pool and we don't kind of know how bad it can be? Or from the body's point of view, trauma is trauma and stress is stress. And we are actually, even though we're not in fear of our lives, we actually are quite high. Is that...
It's a very good question. So the question is, living in the pandemic versus living in a war that's actually happening in another part of the world. Do we really realise how severe other trauma is? Everybody is impacted by trauma differently, dependent on perhaps previous trauma and that sort of thing. So we have this ongoing heightened level of cortisol because there is ongoing trauma. And for some people, the trauma has been life-threatening here in Australia. You're right, we don't have bombs being dropped on us, and that is at a different level. So it's a very good question, but a very complex answer because it's various. I'm going to say it's variant for different people, dependent on what it's been for them. So for people who do have death at their front door because of COVID, their trauma is going to be different than perhaps mine, who is living with it and working with it, but not impacted as directly. So yes, it is different than if we're living in a war zone literally at the moment, but for many here, there's been higher degrees of trauma than for other people because of the way it's impacting them. Yeah, good question.
On your website, do you have some resources to help students that cope or kids, current age kids?
We do. We've got what trauma. We've got regulation tools. We've got a traffic light. So the window of tolerance we've done as a set of traffic lights. So a really basic regulation tool. Yep.
That's getting rolled out on Monday, isn't it, Darren?
How similar is forest therapy to playing golf?
Would you be a golf player?
Very similar, I'm sure.
Very similar. Raph, is that the right answer?
We don't ride through buggies.
Therapy every week.
Excellent to hear. Slow time in nature. I'm sure there's some similarities.
I'm more relaxed if I'm playing power.
I'm sure you do. I'll still play forest therapy, not golf.
Is the vagus nerve the key to dealing with like internal inflammation and things like that?
It can make a big difference.
Can you
Doing
step
that.
forward
Oh,
and make
sorry.
and could you repeat the question?
Oh, the vagus nerve associated with inflammation.
Is it the key to kind of fixing internal?
I think it's
inflammation?
part of the process. Because when we're in the heightened sympathetic nervous system, everything's amplified, and we can take ourselves into that sympathetic nervous system. You know, that rest and digest. All our functions are working at a more agreeable level, and the vagus nerve, you know, working with it in that way. It's the pathway to getting ourselves back into that rest and digest mode. Certainly if our digestion is working better, that's certainly helping with inflammation as well. And you know, the heightened levels of cortisol that Zoe was talking about, also not so great for inflammation. Yeah, it's a good question, but it all ties in, doesn't it?
One more, if there is one more. I just want to, and I'm sure we all do, thank Zoe and Tanya for taking the time. We're a little crew, but we're an engaged crew, are we not? It has been fabulous to hear some things we knew, others we didn't, and linking those things together in a way that makes perfect sense to us. So we want to give you a very big thank you for coming this morning.
Thanks for having us.
And in a moment, there will be morning tea, and it's your opportunity to grab hold of one of these guys. Not literally, social distance, blah, blah, blah. But that's your opportunity to ask more questions. So thank you. If you'd like to take a seat, I've just got one more thing to say before we finish up. And that is that we won't be having a public lecture next month. No one who I've locked in could do the June date, and I thought, you know what, maybe that's not what June is about. So next month we will have actually a friend of Howard's coming along to speak to us about community engagement. So it'll be the same kind of theme, but just it will be a normal church service in a sense. Speaking of which, if you are not involved in a church but are thinking, you know what, I wouldn't mind exploring spirituality, I'm going to suggest Southern's not a bad place to do it, because we have this little phrase, we welcome you where you're at. So whether you love the idea of engaging with God or you're just dabbling with the idea and have 1,000 questions, we meet here at 10:30 on Sunday mornings, and you're welcome to come along to that. 3 other dates, though, I want to tell you about, because the public lectures will kick back in July. On July 24, we have AJ Singh, who's a psychiatrist who runs his own practice. He's the Honorary Associate Professor of Psychiatry at Deakin. I've heard him speak. He's really engaging and will be talking about the same kind of topics as we've had this morning, but it's just you cannot have enough mental health support at this moment in time. So please feel free to come to that and to invite others, July 24. On August 28th, we have Andy Mitchell coming. He is an Indigenous expert who gets around to all sorts of communities in Australia. He's bringing with him a lady called Naomi Wolf, who is an Aboriginal leader, an elder and an academic from Tasmania. He's also trying to get hold of some artists who can display some Aboriginal art for us, which I'm really excited about. So lock that in for August 28. And then September 25, we have Sam Farbod, who came to Australia from Iran, not an asylum seeker, but works every single day with asylum seekers, knows what's going on, knows their heartbeat, particularly with the Farsi-speaking asylum seekers. And he's coming to share a little bit of his story and also give us some indication of how best we can support asylum seekers in our community. So there's some really good stuff coming up. It's all on our website, so feel free to have a look at that. For now, please go chat to other people, have some morning tea, and thank you for attending.